So while everyone settles in for their afternoon nap, I'm going to talk about group policy. So how many of you are using group policy and know it fairly well? Okay, and how many of you are just getting started? Like, okay, all right. And that's kind of what I expected for this group after talking to a bunch of you. But we had decided before the conference that we needed to do a 101 because we were getting feedback in the forums that there was people that had ideas of what it could do, but were a little bit nervous about getting started. So this is probably more for the video than for you folks. But this is, I'm calling it a session and not a class. So if any of you guys have some helpful tips that you think are at this 101 level or whatever, feel free to throw a hand up or whatever, and we'll add that in for everyone's benefit. So to get started, to advance here, come on. There we go. Why use group policies in the first place? So the reason to use group policies is it's going to save you a ton of time if you have a large environment. If you're a real small shop, probably don't need it. Or for stuff like we talked about in the Enterprise WPA2 deployment, there's just no better way to get it done than to put the group policy in. And you know, so there's a whole bunch of good reasons for it. But this is mostly for your larger environments. We're going to go over the prerequisites to it, show you how to create, backup, restore, copy, all the things that you worry about when you're getting started because you're like, I don't want to mess anything up. How to apply them, and then we're going to hit just a couple of sample policies, again, at this entry level. So to answer that why again, biggest reason is you're lazy and you don't want to visit 30, 40, 100, 1,000 machines. It's efficient, okay. The other reason is you're lazy in that you don't want to do the same thing that you did a few months ago again and then try to remember all the tweaks and all that. And that's especially true on the desktop, but even on the server level, how many of you guys have built like a remote desktop server? And then you add another one and another one. And there's little tweaks that you have to do for your environment. And if you build out your RDS group policy, then you apply that policy to your remote desktop server OU, and your next remote desktop server gets all those policies. So this is even cool at the server level. The reason I threw up here is to not hide your system tweaks from the next guy. I came into one environment and we switched from one firewall to the other, but we were doing this all remotely, so the gateway needed to change, and it worked for like everything but a few servers. And we got down into it, and he had gone in and manually added some route commands. Okay. He may have thought of himself as the hero that day, but it sucked for us when we were trying to figure out why can't this server use the new gateway and all that, and it's because he'd manually set up route commands that were just buried in the machine and not any place where we could find it. So by putting, you could edit the local group policy on the machine, the local policy, machine by machine, but that makes it really hard on the next guy to figure out why one computer is not acting right or doing something different. Oop. Okay, so prerequisites. What do you have to have in order to be doing group policies? Well, the first thing is you got to have a domain. And then somebody's going to be like, oh, wait, there's local policies. Well, okay, yes, there is, but it's rare that you're going to do that. That would be, like in the cases where I've used it, I've had one of those really small offices that I'm consulting for, and there's some type of system tweak where pretty much the only way to make it reliable is to use a group policy, and they have no domain, so you go and you edit the local policy. But even then, you're back to do it in the one machine and then the next, so that doesn't really that's not really what we're covering here. You got to know your way around Active Directory users and computers because the policies get applied to OUs, and then the other part is you can do like item level targeting and all that, which gets applied to groups and other stuff. So you got to know your way around Active Directory users and computers. And then the other thing is, it really helps you organize things if you can create OUs in Active Directory and that kind of stuff. Okay, so again, we're at 101 here. So how do you create a group policy? Well, you go to your server and you type in group, and the first thing that shows up is group policy management, and you click on it. Whoa, shocker, right? And this is with Server 2012, but nothing has really changed since 2008. I think 2008 is when they started adding the preferences thing instead of relying on ADMKs, and one of you probably remembers that switch. They bought, I forgot the company that made the preferences thing. It was like a third-party thing. Microsoft bought it, and then it made doing drive mapping and that stuff quite a bit easier. But basically, it's at this level, most of it's been the same ever since it came out. So once you launch the group policy management console, then you can just expand out your tree. Here on this one, we've got a bunch of policies that are already there. If I want to create a new policy, I can go down to Group Policy Objects and just right-click and then create new, and it'll create one there. Or I can expand out an OU and then create a new policy there, and it'll create it under Group Policy Objects and then link it to the OU that I've selected. So that's what we're showing here. You can drill down to an OU, and in this case we created a workstations OU, and then I've selected create a group policy in this domain and link it here. So they've saved you a step there. As you're naming them, this is just something I'll throw out there. Think about how you're going to be searching for this policy later when you need to change it. Okay, so in the example here, the name of it is wallpaper-mango, okay? Now, even though I may be trying to roll out a Mango Lassie wallpaper to all of my machines, if I name it Mango Lassie wallpaper, a year from now, when I'm trying to change it, I'm probably going to forget that I called it the Mango Lassie wallpaper. Somebody's just going to say, hey, Mike, this wallpaper, I'm tired of looking at it, and can we change it? And I'm going to be looking for wallpaper. So name it how you're going to be looking for it later. And in the case of like the RDS server, if you're going to have some RDS policies that are going to go to your servers and then to your clients, your workstations, but you start them all off with RDS, then they're all going to get grouped together. And then when you're searching for that stuff later, it'll all be right there. So once you click create, it just goes and it creates, and once you click OK on that after you name it, it just creates it there. And then the next thing is like, oh, okay, well now what do I do? Well, you would think that like double clicking it would do something, but instead you got to right click and edit, and then it launches up this page, the editor, and this is where you can set all your policies. Now, interesting thing, this is a tidbit that if you're trying to figure out once you've created a policy, or if a policy is already there and you're like, okay, where have I applied this thing all the way on down through? Funny thing is, like, you'd think it'd be a way to like right click and properties on it here and say, okay, where is this all linked and stuff? You can't. You've actually got to edit it, and then you can right click on the policy here and go to properties, and then you can get a tab that shows you where you linked the thing. It's a little weird, and I might even hit that later, but it just occurred to me now. So At any rate, we've got two sections to our group policy. We've got the computer configuration and then the user configuration. And the difference is stuff that needs to get done for the whole computer gets done up in the computer thing, and stuff that's particular to the logged on user gets done there. That becomes important when you're trying to do stuff like creating desktop icons, okay? Because if you do it in the user configuration piece, but you try to write it to that magical C users public desktop, it won't go. And why is it not going? Because the user doesn't have access to, if you've locked down the machine, they don't have access to the public folder on that computer. So in that case, you've got to go up and do that under the computer configuration. But if you want to write a desktop icon to their profile, then you're going to do that under the user side. So in this case, the wallpaper, that's a per user thing, right? If you switch accounts, you can have different wallpaper for different people. So you're going to do that under the user piece of it. And you can see we just navigate on down, policies, administrative templates, desktop, and then desktop and desktop wallpaper. And there you've got all your settings. And all of the good ones have meaningful descriptions that tell you what you can do and what it means to enable versus disable, and sometimes that's straightforward and other times it's not. So in this case, put the path in there, and remember, if it's in the user part, the user concept that it's running in needs to have access to that path. And the flip side of that, if it's up in the computer part, the computer account on the machine has to have access to that path. Okay, so then once you hit OK there, and you close that out, now if you click on your policy here, you've got the scope tab, and this says where it's going to get applied. And you can do some filtering here, so you could apply it to an O. There you go. There we go. All right. So you've got your scope there, and you can scope stuff out. Oh, there you go. The details tab, nothing real meaningful here except for I've highlighted the unique ID, and these policies get stored under the sys file, and when you go to troubleshoot things later, that becomes important because that's what that policy is under. You go under the sys file and the policies, and then you don't see your wallpaper mango.pol file or something like that. You see these long string of characters, and then the question then is, okay, well, how do I relate that back to my policy? Well, this is where you can find it. The settings tab, this is the one that you're going to almost all the time because you're in an environment, they've got group policies doing some stuff, and you want to be like, okay, what exactly is this policy doing? Do I need it anymore? Is it relevant? Is this pushing out? You know, they called it Internet Explorer. What is it doing? And then you're like, oh, it's for Internet Explorer 8, not needed anymore, I can get rid of it. So basically you can hit that settings tab, and right up at the top, you've got your hide all or show all, and by default, they're all collapsed. And you could go through and click on each one and expand it, or almost every time I go in here, I just hit the show all, and then just start scrolling down through. They don't put a find box in there, but if you're a keyboard shortcut fanatic like I am, you can hit Control F, and it'll actually work in there and pop up a find thing, and you can search on down through stuff. Yeah, it's IE, so it should work like that, but they don't put any way for you to click on anything, but the keyboard shortcut still works. Now the last tab, a lot of people get confused with this one. It's the delegation. And they think that, oh, I want this only to apply to this group, so they start messing with security here. No. This is for if you're in a really large environment and you want the help desk guys to be able to change the wallpaper on the machines every week or whatever. You can delegate. You know, this goes back to when Microsoft started to try to make granular administration of the servers. This is how they take care of that piece. So you can set permissions here so some of your more entry-level guys can go and edit some policies, but not all policies. Okay, so you're just getting started out and you want to back up a policy so you can restore it later in case you mess it up. This is one of those, oh, that was it kind of things, because you just right-click on it, back up, and then it says, okay, where do you want to back it up from? It's important to remember the location where you back these things up. And if you're doing a bunch of changes, it's a really good idea to back it up this way, because that means it's going to be really quick for you to restore it, rather than trying to mess around with your backup software and navigate sysvals on domain controllers and all that kind of stuff. To restore it, you just go all the way up to your group policy objects folder in the group policy manager, and then right-click on that and hit manage backups. And when you do, as long as you remember that backup path where you backed it up, it'll show you everything in that folder, and then even give you the times and stuff and which version of it that it is, and you can say, oh, yep, that's the one I want, and restore that one. Copy it, copy paste. That's it. The only weird thing is when you do paste it in there, it does the old Microsoft typical copy of wallpaper-mango. So then, you know, you got to scroll way up in your list and nope, there it is. And find it and then rename it and put it back down so it matches the name as the other ones that you want it grouped with. Deleting it, there it is. Right-click, delete. Nothing too exciting about that. Now, applying. Like I said, when you first create it, you can create it and link it right in one step, or you can create it under the group policy objects folder, then go up through and navigate on down through your OUs and link it. And that's useful, especially if you're going to create a policy where you've got OUs, maybe you split it up by sites or something like that. And then you want to go through and apply it to the sales group in this site and the sales group in this site and this site. You don't have to create 3 policies. You create one policy and then go through and link it to that one and link it to that one. And all you do to link it is right-click on it, link an existing GPO, select it, and hit OK. That's all there is to it. Now I mentioned different locations, and you could go out and create OUs for your different sites. How many of you are using the sites and subnets feature? No? Okay. All right. So in Active Directory, you've got that sites and services thing. You can define the subnets that your different sites are on, and then you can tell it. You can create your sites, and then you can say this subnet belongs in this site. And that's really cool, because then in your group policy, you can go down through and say, okay, in this site, I want to deploy these printers. And that way, if the user or the computer is bouncing around between different sites, it doesn't matter. When that computer shows up with that subnet, it's going to say, oh, okay, you're in Rochester now. I'm going to give you these printers. And, oh, you're back in Iowa. here, you get these printers and all that. So that's really cool to be able to use that if you have one of those multi-site environments. So now we're moving on to one of the samples. Everybody is mapping drives, right? Now, I remember at one point, probably 2 years ago, as we were first trying to deal with CryptoLocker, some people were like, oh, get rid of map drives, right? How many people heard that one? Yeah, okay. And the thought process was if you had no map drives, then CryptoLocker might encrypt the local machine, but it wouldn't rip your network. Well, then CryptoLocker started searching out UNC shares and everything else, and so now we're back to there's no good reason not to map drives. So in most environments that I'm working with, there's map drives, and we've got to manage those. I'm still coming across people that are using DOS batch files or command scripts and stuff to map them, and when you see how easy it is to do it in PowerShell, you're like, why would I even try? And not just the ease of it, but the flexibility. Like in the DOS batch file, you're not going to be able to label it so that your S drive for sales gets actually an Internet Explorer labeled sales. Okay, that's helping your users out. Okay, / file server 1 / share doesn't really help your users out. So in the drive mapping, this is one of those things that I mentioned that Microsoft bought the preferences piece from third party and added on. So some stuff is a little weird trying to figure out, is this under preferences or under policies? The policies, there's default Windows stuff that's in there to begin with. And beyond that, like, let's say you want to tweak Office 365, Office 2016, 2013, or something like that. That's not built in there. All the settings that you can tweak there are not built in. You have to go out and get ADMK files, download those, install those on your server. And the only thing that's not real obvious about that is there's always a language file with them. And you need to put the ADMK file and the language file needs to go in the subdirectory. If you do that, then everything works like it should. If you only put the ADMK and not the language file, then you try to go in there and you're like, hey, how come I can't see this, and all that sort of stuff. But the preferences, the stuff that we most commonly use, the stuff that we're configuring day in, day out, most of that stuff wound up in there. So when you're just starting out, either Google what you're trying to do and see where it is, or poke around under preferences and see if you can't do it there. Drive mapping is under there, so that's where you go. Preferences, Windows settings, and drive maps. Now, when you go to map your first drive, you get the option to create it, replace it, update it, or delete it. And a lot of guides call this the CRUD, okay? And I put the definitions of those things in here because they're not totally obvious. You know, it's okay, what's the difference if I update it or create it? Like, what happens? I've got those definitions there. You can read them and go back to it and look it up. And that way, you can make sure that it's going to behave like you want it to. There's cases where there's already a drive there and you need it to change to a new server, and so you're going to use the update thing, where in other cases the create is going to be more applicable. The cool thing too is that you can delete a mapping in there as stuff comes and goes. And there's even a checkbox in there where you can tell it just delete all the mappings, and under the printers one, which I think we're going to get to next, they have that same functionality. Another cool thing about using group policy to map the drive is the item level targeting, okay? So once you've created the map, you can right-click on it, then go to Properties, then click on the Common tab, and then check the box that says Item Level Targeting. So way back out in the beginning of creating the policy, for the whole policy you can target who's going to get it based on that. But for the drive mappings, you can even target each drive so that, okay, I want accounting to get mapped to the T drive, but only users in the accounting group. So you go in there, right-click the drive letter, then go to the Common tab, Item Level Targeting, click the Targeting button, and then for criteria, say New Item, and then Security Group, and as soon as you hit Security Group, it pops up the familiar, okay, type the security group name or browse to it, and then you can say, okay, I want the accounting security group to get this drive letter, and then they're the only ones that will get that mapped. So that's pretty cool stuff that you just is not easy with command line or anything else. Next thing we're going to talk about is printers. Now, printers are like the bane of IT existence. Is anybody? Yeah, okay. Yeah, printers are awful. And most of the time it's because of the drivers, okay? The printers are what they are and they work, but, you know, this person, well, when I print from Word, this comes out, and then when I print from Excel, it's all funny, and the characters all over, and it won't stop. Yeah, so, and then you got to tweak the drivers. So by deploying it with group policy, when you have to make one of those driver updates, it's way easier than going around machine to machine and adding them that way. A couple of things on that. At the beginning, we talked about the fact that you can target it by computer or you can target it by user. You can add printers to the computer so that anyone that logs in, it's there, or you can add them by user. It's faster if you deploy them by computer, and it gets added once and it's there. When you do it by user logs in, and as they're logging in, the group policy is applying because it's a per user one, so it has to apply that policy. The printer actually gets installed then. So that first time logging in for that user, it's going to be a bit slower. The other weird use case for doing it as a local printer is remote desktop. How many people are using remote desktop and then mapping local printers through? Anybody? Okay. I ran into that where all the user was doing was logging to the computer and then boom, launching their remote desktop session because that's how they actually did their work. And in some cases, having the printer get installed through the user policy was so slow, the printer wasn't readily available for remote desktop to pick the thing up and display it. So they'd go to print out of remote desktop and the printer wouldn't even show up. But then we toggled back to Windows and sure enough, it was there. So anyways, if you do it under the user context and use a shared printer and you're not doing straight from the computer to the printer, like a TCP/IP printer, your stuff shows up in a queue and you can delete people's jobs and all that kind of stuff. But let's face it, in the last 15 years, printers pretty much print fast enough that by the time you hit print and then walk over to the thing, it's there. It's not like years ago where you would send your job and other people would send their job and you'd all be standing around waiting for your stuff to come out and somebody needed priority and needed to move their stuff up in the queue. Like, we're just not there anymore. So there's just not as much of a need for that. The other thing I'll throw out about printers is nobody cares what model of printer is installed. They do care where it is, okay? If they hit print, forgot to check where their default printer was, and they know that it came out on a Toshiba, that's not very helpful to them, okay? What are they supposed to do, run around the building? Does anybody know where the Toshiba is? And yeah, if you name the printer front office or accounting department or mechanical, then they've got an idea of where their documents are sitting. So when you're in there and you're creating the printer, give it a user-friendly name. So to get started with that whole thing, first you've got to add the printer. In either case, whether you're doing it by computer or by user, you've got to go to one of your servers and create the printer share. So you add the printer and do that whole thing. If you still got 32-bit Windows 7 or whatever, go back in there under additional drivers and add those drivers too. If you happen to be using a printer by one of those manufacturers that has the unsigned drivers or something stupid like that, where it throws up a warning and then makes you click OK before it'll do it. If there's anything that's keeping that printer from you just go into the share, double-clicking it, and have it install, you got to fix that, because this is only going to work if it's totally hands-off. So the way to get around like that unsigned driver thing, go back to your friend group policy, add in a thing not to prompt for unsigned printer drivers, and then those things will just go when you hit them. So add your printer to the print server, then go back over to your group policy, and in this case we're in the computer configuration, so we're deploying this by the computer. Now, the computer is going to, because we're adding this as a TCP/IP printer, and it's not going to the server share, it's going to print straight from the computer to the printer. But it needs to grab the drivers from the server for that first time out. So that printer path in there needs to be in there, and the drivers need to be set up on the server so that all the computers get the right driver. And let's see, yeah. And then once you've done that, then you'll see the whole path thing in there. This time we're doing it under the user configuration. So this is a shared printer, and you can see that you can delete stuff and add stuff and all that. So those are the samples that I had for everyone. Does anyone have any other comments or suggestions or tips that they've found along the way getting started? Yes?
So since it's kind of a 101 video, can you explain why inheritance and messing with the default group policies is not a good idea?
Okay, so so the question was, at this 101 level here, can you explain why messing with the default stuff is a bad idea? That default domain policy, I've come into environments where they just kept editing the default domain policy, which, by the way, gets applied all the way at the top of your domain. The only exception is the servers OU. That one typically inheritance is blocked, and that was the second part, is inheritance and stuff. So first thing, stay away from that default domain policy. In fact, you probably want to unapply it, because in like small business server, that's how they get things done. If I may remember that. Now it's called Server Essentials. They do a lot of stuff through there. And the funny thing about the reason I bring up small business server is they provided a path for you to migrate from small business server to server standard, which is logical. You'd start out small and then things would grow. But that policy will mess you up later, because it's doing things like it's setting your DNS servers, because small business server will work with Windows Home stuff, and it'll work with your own router stuff, not a Windows DHCP server. It's counting on the fact that you might have your router doing DHCP and you don't have control of that. So it uses group policy to set your DNS servers, which can screw you up when you're trying to use your Windows server and use DHCP to set those settings, and then group policy overwrites what you just did with DHCP. So I would unlink the default domain policy and not use it, and don't add it or anything like that. And then in inheritance, so that's where you you've got to make a conscious decision about how you're setting up your OUs and what you're trying to do, and then what you want to inherit. And obviously, something like a wallpaper or whatever, you know that's a desktop thing, so you're going to have your desktop OU and just push that out on there, and you're not gonna even link it up at the top level and have to worry about it inheriting on down. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Oh, right. Yes. Any other questions or comments to add?
So something else maybe to mention for a starter person is an OU versus a non-OU item in Active Directory users and computers.
Yeah, so what Jason said was something to point out is you've got, in Active Directory users and computers, there's folders that are set up that are not OUs. The default ones are not OUs, so you cannot do OU level stuff with them. So you almost always, even though they have the users one and then the computers one, you can't apply stuff to that. So you've got to create your own OU, which then you can create other OUs under and break things all out. So you almost always, once your network grows to the point where you're trying to separate off physical machines and virtual machines and all that, creating your own OUs in there so that you can start doing that OU targeting. Okay, any other comments? Cool. Well, thank you, everyone.